Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 21st of July. So much news is flooding in. Watch my shorts on Biden dropping out of the 2024 presidential race and endorsing Kamala Harris if you're interested. If there is enough supports, then I will do videos exclusively about American politics. But for now, we're looking at the war in Ukraine, which is still continuing. The Russian forces did advance in Krasnohorivka. We'll look at that. We'll also look at some new events just to the south of Marinka, also on the Vavch River front, a lot of important developments. And also around Berestov and Pishchane. We talked about this front 2 weeks ago in detail, and now we're seeing some of what I said begin to manifest over there. But let's begin by looking at the situation in Krasnohorivka, which really is one of the larger advances of today. We're looking at a Russian advance that amounts to somewhere in the ballpark of 400 meters northwards. We also have this geolocation, which is from July 20th. It shows a Russian tank firing towards various Ukrainian positions in this street over here, Nakhimova Street. This is one of the frontline streets going horizontally that the Ukrainians still maintain positions in, at least in the northwestern corner. And so the Russian forces, for the first time in a while, we've seen them move tanks and armored vehicles up to the front line. In previous videos from the Ukrainian side, we saw lone Russian soldiers advancing house to house without any sort of vehicular supports. But in this case, I believe the Russians were able to advance near this park region with all of the shrubbery and make it all the way up to these horizontal roads. And these are now acting as dividing lines where the Ukrainians are trying to maintain the control and prevent the Russians from getting full, really control in particular roads that are south of the floodplain over here, because the Ukrainians do not just want to have control over the floodplains and the Krupskoy Street to the north. They do still want to maintain a foothold within northwestern Krasnohorivka for as long as possible. They want to have supply lines into it open. They want to continue flooding it with manpower and targeting advancing Russians with drones. They're trying to dig in here for as long as possible. That is evident based on the fact they have not withdrawn to more favorable positions and utilized the floodplain as a buffer. And so we see that now the Russian forces have to, by force, go in with tanks, fire towards remaining Ukrainian soldiers within houses, and do so as the Ukrainians try to stand their ground and actually return fire, whether it be through FPVs or ATGMs targeting those Russian vehicles. But for now, what we know is that the Russian forces have been able to get control over a large portion of the gray zone over here, the entirety of this park region, which means the Russian forces now have a large western flank supporting their positions located in this hospital region and all the apartments over here, meaning it will be more comfortable for the Russians now to advance directly northwards and pass the Lazova River, which is very narrow in certain portions. In other areas, it's more so akin to a pond, and begin to finally infiltrate into the last vestiges of northern Krasnohorivka suburbs. At the same time, they are also inching closer and closer to getting control over all these private residential areas. In recent updates by Deep State and Petrenko, they're admitting that my marking of the situation based on geolocations is correct. I can't really adjust the map because my mapping already showed the furthest Russian extent due to that proof, but now Ukrainians are beginning to admit to those same facts. And so you have the Russian forces continuing to advance here, nearly reaching Nakhimova and even further northwards. And actually, if we're talking about a drone arsenal, then the drone element of the 100th Mechanized Brigade, the Voron Group, previously had a presence in Krasnohorivka. It no longer does because it was moved to help the rest of the brigade with its defensive activities in Novo-Oleksandrivka and Lozhevatske that are extremely important right now, and we'll get to later on in the video. But now let's begin looking at Novelske, because we know for a fact that the Russians are at least in a certain portion of Novelske. Ukrainians may or may not be remaining in this warehouse region. You know, there are a few trenches and trees, so you could hole up a small squad to try to just maintain control and drag it out. So I'm not going to say that it's a gray zone or under Russian control until we have evidence to the contrary, but the Russians definitely have inched closer and closer to it. We know this based on a video from July 21st from a drone compilation showing the Ukrainians dropping grenades onto dugouts east of Novelske, the same dugouts that they really constructed over a long period of time, and they're not really well worked, intricate defenses, but they are scattered dugouts. And you could tell why, because you want to be able to send in a small force and just hold on to it for an extended period of time, rotate out, be sent back in, and try to evade any sort of larger Russian artillery strikes by using the concealment in some of these tree lines. But now the Russian forces have taken over these same dugouts and are using them for the same purposes of seeking concealment as the Ukrainians try to target them with their own drone crews in the region. The Russian troop density here is very low because most of their troops in this theater are fighting in Krasnohorivka, where there isn't a large Russian garrison either. It's mainly one brigade from the 1st Army Corps that is doing most of the work, with some artillery support from a specific artillery detachment in Donetsk. And then you have a large Russian garrison further northward in Netsalove. But then in between, given the nature of the battlefield here, due to the old open fields, only Velska being a village here, there isn't as much Russian focus. And I think the Russians also acknowledge there doesn't have to be, because with the fall of Krasnohorivka, there will no longer be an organized means for the Ukrainians to organize, their frontline forces, their equipment, defenses east of the Vavcha River. There's simply not going to be a location for that, and there has to be a node for it. And the nearest node is on the west bank of the river, where you have all of these villages that are currently being built up, and the Ukrainians definitely are trying to construct a line of defense here that could be more durable and protect the northern flank of Kurakova, for instance. And it's also based around certain ridges. Certain ridges, for instance, the one over here, the Ukrainians really want to maximize their use of embankments because they've lost so many over these past few months. And they're not going to be losing an embankment this time with these fields here, because these fields are located in a killing zone, overlooked, you could say, further to the southeast by Russian positions in Donetsk that you don't really see on the screen. But yeah, it's not any sort of advantageous position. The only reason why it's important is because it's buying time for the defensive line further westwards. So yeah, my point with all of this is that the Russian forces were able to advance a total of 800 meters, 900 meters westwards. It is an important advance because we just haven't seen it recently. And we'll have to see if they're able to push even further westwards into Novelska and nearby roads with trenches. Looking further north, Novoselivka, Pishchane, no update from there. A lot of developments going on around the railway embankment, which is something that I focused on so much, and now you're beginning to see why. In Prohres, you can see that, first of all, the Russian forces have control of even fields just to the west of it. Ukrainian sources are now admitting that the Ukrainians had one brigade in the theater generally defending around Prohres. It wasn't specified which unit it was, because you did have the 47th Brigade generally operating in the region, but they were split up and also had attention further south in Voskod or Novoselivka, Persha. You also have 110th Brigade operating around here, but they're also defending in Lozhevatske. And you have the 100th Brigade, as we said. So it's not totally clear which unit was defending here specifically. But when the Russians conducted their very large organized attack on July 19th, it was enough for the Russians to begin infiltrating through the forced patches into eastern Prohres. And by the 20th of July, reinforcements from another active combat unit made it to the region. And I would say that would likely be the 47th Brigade, trying to fill up any holes. But even those reinforcements, according to Ukrainian sources, were not enough to stabilize the situation because of the momentum the Russians had and because Prohres is small and not really fortified. And so the Ukrainians withdrew within that 24-hour period. So the village itself wasn't really fought over. The Russians took it over very quickly. Now the question is, where the Ukrainians where are they going to dig in now? Where is the line going to stabilize? Because you could see that the Russians are continuing to advance along the rail line, along the two parallel windbreaks. And why wouldn't they? They're located right next to a very important road, so you can have constant support from MTLBs and renew attacks if they fail. You have the windbreaks to give you concealment, and you're located on heights that overlook nearby valleys. So now Vovcha is overlooked by the Russian positions over here, and any other village that is located along the Vavcha River line is also overlooked to the south. That is a big issue for those villages. Another big issue is for all the tributaries that are sort of sticking out over here. I don't know if you would call them tributaries, but these sort of like valleys that are protruding out of these larger towns like Heorhiivka, they're all located on a low elevation. You can just see the patterns for it. They're all branching out of the Torets River, and they're all major villages that are now about to become a part of the front line, and they are all overlooked by the rail embankment, whether it be under Russian control at the moment, which I'll mark in this sort of pink over here, or whether they're still under Ukrainian control, marked in blue. The Russians are still advancing along the same vector, and so they're going to try to take over the blue crosses. And at that point, they will have direct sight to overlook nearby Ukrainian villages that are all on lower elevation and all lead towards key logistic hubs like Heorhiivka. If you zoom out, Heorhiivka is a junction of roads. It connects to Mirnohrad, and then from there to the front line, to the rail line. And if you zoom out even further westwards, you could see that it's sort of like the southeastern artery for Prohres, and there are actually trenches built around its western perimeter, and probably way more trenches that are not mapped on my specific map at the moment. I have to add in the new files for these maps, and it's all in marked in yellow here. And so definitely you don't want to lose your eastern flank for a key logistics hub like Heorhiivka. So that's why the Russians continue advancing directly past Prohres. But in any case, let's look just north, where the Russian advance through Prohres also opened up a new vector for the Russians to advance just north of the rail line and advance also along this vertical road and connect with another Russian attack that is occurring around Lozhevatske. The Russians captured Lozhevatske around 3 days ago, I believe, and now they're trying to connect these two vectors. And at the moment, Deep State's mapping, for instance, shows that there are still Ukrainians in this gap between the two pincers. I don't think that's likely that there are any Ukrainians holed up in these tree lines here. By now, they would have sensed that there was a Russian pressure trying to create a cauldron from both sides on a smaller scale, and would have tried to advance or retreat in this case. And perhaps in that sort of effort, in that vein, they would have been caught by the Russian forces and eliminated. I have no idea, because this is really recent news from the past 24 hours. But I would like to hear from Ukrainian sources, from the 110th and 100th Brigades, to see what their commentary is on the Russian solidification of control in between the rail line and Lozhevatske in this hill region, because it is located on a hill that extends even further westwards. Essentially, all this region over here is a hill, and Ukrainians partially control it, but the Russians are aiming to get full control, full seizure of that land. And at that point, they would be overlooking the Prohres River in its entirety. All of the villages here, they're all on a floodplain like Timofivka, and then even going northwards to Voshvizhenka and all of these other villages that are on this vertical line that is sort of parallel to the highway. If the highway is over here, then the vertical line of villages is over here for you guys to see. And all those regions are also located on valleys that are overlooked by the hills and the embankments that I talked about over here, and then also by the hills that are located over here. And the second one, the larger, more vertical sort of X marking, is still under Ukrainian control to a large extent. And so I would be interested to see whether the Russians make a detour into that area and try to get additional control over that piece of geography. Albeit for now, they've been focusing on just continually pushing in the northwestern direction. And in their effort to do so, they are, as I said before, about 6-7 kilometers away from the ring road over here, connecting Krasnohorivka to the city of Pokrovsk. And that attack vector is also located on a ridge. It is really interesting how the Russians are specifically choosing to advance along ridges, not just because of the ridges, but also because of what's built on the ridges, whether it be a rail line or a key road. And so the Russians are advancing through this region over here, where there may be some sort of gap in the Ukrainian lines. I wouldn't be 100% certain, because there could be additional trenches not mapped over here. But you could see how there is this massive density of Ukrainian defenses right east of the highway, and then also directly to the east of the Pokrovsk suburbs. And so there may be an opportunity to create a sort of discontinuity between these lines of defenses by penetrating through the middle, through areas that are generally on open fields and are generally on hills that overlook the various trenches that we saw marked to the east and to the west from either side. And so that is something that has to be kept in mind. But also, when we see the Russian advance here, understand that they want to unlock the roads and then use them to their benefits. Now, moving on to the Luhansk front, I made a video 2 weeks ago talking about reports of Russian penetrations just to the southeast of Pishchane. We had geolocated footage from July 6th of the 205th Battalion of the 241st Territorial Defense Brigade when they repelled a Russian mechanized assault trying to actually reach into the approaches of Pishchane. This happened following a concerted Russian effort, mainly from the 1st Guards Tank Army and then some territorial motor rifle units that were created this year, actually, that operated just to the east of Tabaivka. They were not able to get full control over it, which would have given the Russians a forward operating base to then spread out and act as a linchpin. But they were able to secure, as a result, additional parts of the highway and also get this local hill under their control. And so then from there, they were able to advance south of the salient and reach Berestove. That was big because now you had this rather large salient for the Russian forces that was located just to the southeast of Pishchane and overlooking, not necessarily overlooking because Berestove is on low elevation, but at least flanking from the north, Heorhiivka, which is one of Ukraine's largest garrisons on the front line and also connects to other frontline villages that are all on the same chain that is trying to maintain the current control boundaries. And so Berestove unlocked new Russian vectors of attack, specifically, as we said before, northwest towards Pishchane. We saw information about a Russian advance very deep into Pishchane as early as over a week ago, and that was according to Ukrainian sources, but we never received footage. Now we actually have footage which verifies everything that we've been reporting for a very long time now. So this is from July 20th. It's a video of a Russian infantry squad walking within Pishchane. No presence of Ukrainians seen, and they raised the flag, and it's over a World War II memorial, and so you could see that it is pretty much in the center of Pishchane, even going further into the western portion. And Pishchane is divided by the Pishchane River, which runs through a field in between, similar to the way in which Novoslivka Persha has it, for instance. And now what we don't know is the status of the outskirts of Pishchane, because a lot of Russian sources have claimed full capture. That is yet to be seen because we don't know what's going on with some of these agricultural facilities and forests just to the north. We don't know what's going on with some of the houses on the far western side or the southwestern corner. And we have to be cautious because there is a Ukrainian garrison here. It can't be totally written off because in recent weeks, there have been rotations around here, movement of some units away from the front line. So, for instance, the 104th Territorial Defense Brigade, I was under the belief that they were defending in this region, and I believe I had proof of it, but I don't try to keep proof along with the unit icons. I just mark it on the map, and now it appears that they have a presence along the Velika and Vasilka sector, which means that there's actually been a rotation at some point because the 110th Brigade, which previously operated around Pryutny near the Velika and Vasilka sector, is now filming videos of their operations at this section of the front line. Their first video from this part of the battlefield is from their freaky drone unit, that's what it's called. It destroyed a Russian T-72 that was parked in the region just east of Pishchane, showing how the Russians are really big on using a large amount of armor here. In terms of the amount of armor used in recent months, a massive amount has come and has been coming together in concentrations from this part of the front line. The Russians have a particular emphasis on tank units over here, whether it be the 4th Tank Army or 1st Tank Army or various smaller elements like the 26th Tank Regiment. They are very active around here, especially with tanks, as we said before, but also BMPs, MTLBs, whatever it may be. Because of the nature of the battlefield here, there's way more open fields to pass through. And so when reaching a village that is further away, the Russian forces here are more willing to take a risk by sending in as well armored supports to suppress enemy fire, but also to protect the soldiers that are within. And so now we'd see the Russians have created this massive sort of protruding area in Pishchane. Since the beginning of this advance from Krokhmalne, the Russians have gained 6 kilometers, so it is a large advance. We don't know what's going on north of Pishchane with these trenches here. They have to be kept in mind because the Ukrainians do control a local hill just to the west of Tabaivka, where you do have the presence of the 1st Special Purpose Brigade, a very important unit in this region. Of course, we have territorial defense elements, and then to the south, we have at least 1 battalion of the territorial defense units, and we have the 4th Tank Brigade. 3rd Tank Brigade is also generally floating around this part of the front line, but we don't know exactly where. Going a bit further south, I will in a second, but I just want to mention why Pishchane is so important. It acts as a key. It unlocks 2 ridges. It unlocks the one to the south, which is the easier one to capture because it is relatively undefended. The Ukrainians can't really quickly send in reinforcements because you don't really see paved roads here. The Russians have an opportunity to use their armored columns and their resources to push through this region, get control over a large swath of hills, and that would, by virtue of doing so, flank from the west the front line where you have Heorhiivka and various other hamlets, and also overlook them because we're all running along the Zherebets River Valley. That would be very difficult for the Ukrainians to maintain control over. And at the same time, it would also overlook all of these other villages that are along the Oskil River, and that would contribute to the eventual degradation of the Ukrainian positions east of said river. And looking further north, you also have an attempt to get control over this ridge over here. You have a massive open area south of the highway, which does have more defensive density than the one south of it. But nonetheless, again, not as many roads in this region, not a lot of settlements. And again, the Russians do have an opportunity to expand past Pishchane. It would require them sort of clearing up the Tabaevka area first. Once doing so, it would be a massive threat to this chain of villages over here that don't have strategic depth between them and the river. There's only the vertical road, no horizontal roads really. And it would also mean the Russians inching closer and closer to that southern, southeastern in this case, flank of Kupiansk. Also, I should have mentioned this earlier, but we have this video that was released by the 46th Air Assault Brigade on July 20th. It shows how they were able to repel 1 BMP and 2 Russian tanks, utilizing FPV drones, of course, which the 46th Brigade is notorious for doing, but also directing artillery strikes with D-30 122mm howitzers. And so this gain is confirmation of a Russian advance amounting to around 600-700 meters, and shows how the Russians are gradually strengthening their positions in these hinterlands between Pobieda and Heorhiivka. At the same time, the Russians have not been able to penetrate past the Ukrainian defensive lines here. The Ukrainians do have some troop density in this region. Besides 46th Brigade, they also have the 33rd here, and what is this? The 31st, yeah. And so they're trying to keep control over this gap. And when I say gap, I mean gap in the sense there's no villages here. It's just fields. They want to prevent the Russians from getting control here and then reaching all the way westwards to the southeastern corner of the Kharkov defense line. That's the rationale. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.